One submarine fires 6 torpedoes and hits 3 different ships. On the 15th of September, 1942, southwest of San Cristobal Island in the Solomons, the commander of the Japanese submarine 119 raises his periscope one last time before the attack. An American carrier is crossing his firing arc. Takaichi Kinashi lines up on it, waits for the angle, and at 14:44 he gives the order to fire. He is aiming at one ship. He is as certain of this shot as a man can be after 9 months of running a submarine through an ocean where almost no Japanese boats are left, and coming home every single time. He expects 3 or 4 hits on the carrier. He is going to get more. 3 torpedoes will slam into the side of the carrier USS Wasp. She will burn and go under by nightfall. The remaining torpedoes will pass her by. They will not turn, and they will not stop. They will keep running, across 3 kilometers of open water, toward a formation of ships Kinashi cannot see in his periscope, and is not even thinking about in this moment. One will strike a battleship. One will strike a destroyer. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how a single torpedo salvo from one boat crippled a carrier, a battleship, and a destroyer in a matter of seconds. Why it is still considered the most effective torpedo attack in the history of naval warfare, and why the man who fired it never learned where his torpedoes actually went. And there is one more thing, something the Japanese fleet would fail to grasp in time. When the smoke over the Wasp cleared, the United States had exactly 1 operational aircraft carrier left in the entire Pacific. 1. And within 41 days, the Japanese sank that one too. Before we go any further, one quick question. Because among the people who watch videos like this, there are always some who know the subject from the inside. Tell me in the comments what country you are watching from and whether anyone in your family ever served in the Navy. I genuinely want to know who is on the other side of the screen. Now let us go back to the 15th of September, 1942, to an ocean that already has 6 torpedoes running beneath it. The 15th of September was the 41st day of the battle for Guadalcanal. American Marines had landed on the island on the 7th of August. They seized an unfinished Japanese airfield and named it Henderson Field after a pilot killed at Midway. From that day, the war on the island ran in the same loop. By day, the airfield belonged to the Americans, and their aircraft owned the sky. By night, Japanese destroyers came down the strait between the islands, put fresh infantry ashore, and were gone before dawn. American sailors called that strait the Slot. The Japanese called the nightly runs the Tokyo Express. Most accounts of Guadalcanal turn on jungle fighting and on cruisers trading fire in the dark. But the real machinery of the campaign was duller and harder than that. The question was not who would win a given battle. The question was whose supply chain would hold out longer. The Japanese could move men. The Americans could move everything else: fuel, ammunition, food, aircraft. Whoever's supply line snapped first would lose the island. And supply across the ocean in 1942 rested on aircraft carriers. The aircraft from Henderson Field covered the island itself and the water around it, out to their radius. Beyond that lay the zone where the only source of an air umbrella was carrier aviation. A transport convoy with no carrier overhead in those waters became a slow target. That is exactly why, on the 15th of September, a convoy carrying reinforcements to the Marines was steaming toward Guadalcanal under the cover of 2 full carrier groups. The problem was how many carriers the United States actually had left. By the middle of September 1942, the American fleet had already lost 4 of the 7 carriers it entered the war with. The Lexington went down in the Coral Sea in May. The Yorktown sank at Midway in June, after absorbing everything Japanese aviation put into her, and was finished off by a Japanese submarine on the 3rd day after she had already been reported sunk. The Saratoga took a torpedo from a Japanese boat in late August, and by mid-September was under repair. The Wasp had spent the summer making 2 runs into the Mediterranean, delivering about 100 Spitfire fighters to the defense of Malta, and had then come to the Pacific. Count it with me. 7 carriers at the start of the war. 1 on the bottom of the Coral Sea, 1 on the bottom off Midway, 1 in the yard after a torpedo. The Enterprise was in the yard too, repairing damage from the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August. That leaves 2 in service for the whole Pacific, USS Wasp and USS Hornet. And on the 15th of September, both of them were running side by side over the same convoy a few miles apart. They had been split into 2 separate task forces on purpose. Task Force 18 held the carrier Wasp with her cruisers and destroyers under Rear Admiral Lee Noyes. Task Force 17 held the carrier Hornet, the new battleship North Carolina, and her escorts under Rear Admiral George Murray. The distance between the groups was set so that a single attack could not catch both. This was standard American tactical doctrine. The commanders made the call deliberately, the way they were trained to. The whole calculation rested on one assumption, that a torpedo fired at one group could not reach the other, that a few kilometers of open water between formations were a guarantee. In 1942, that assumption was true for every torpedo the American fleet knew about. It did not account for the Japanese Type 95 torpedo. Before we go on, it is worth understanding what kind of ship the USS Wasp was, because it is her particular features that turned 3 torpedo hits into a sinking. The Wasp was the last American carrier built under the Washington Naval Treaty. The treaty capped the total carrier tonnage a nation could hold, and by the time her designers took up the Wasp, almost the entire American allowance was already spent on larger ships. The Wasp got what was left. She had to fit a full carrier into a displacement that was not enough for a full carrier. Her standard displacement was around 14,700 tons. The Yorktown-class ships ran to nearly 20,000. That gap of 5,000 tons is not an abstract number. It is armor that was left off. It is compartments that were not divided by one more bulkhead. It is fuel lines that were routed where there was room for them, rather than where it would have been safest. Aviation gasoline on the Wasp was carried in piping routed closer to the outer hull than on newer ships. The engineers knew this. They recorded it at the design stage and accepted it as the unavoidable price of missing tonnage. It was not considered critical, right up until the moment it became critical. Hold on to that detail. One fuel line run a little closer to the hull than it should have been. We are going to come back to it, and you will see the entire disaster pass straight through it. On the afternoon of the 15th of September, the Wasp's air group was working a normal routine. Some planes were flying combat air patrol. Others were coming back aboard, landing, refueling. Fuel hoses ran across the hangar deck from the fueling stations to the aircraft. This was the routine of a carrier's day, with nothing exceptional about it. And that was the whole point. The ship was in her most vulnerable state, with open fuel lines and fueled aircraft, precisely while doing perfectly ordinary work. About 200 meters below the surface, at periscope depth, the commander of I-19, Takaichi Kinashi, held the carrier in his crosshairs. Kinashi had commanded this boat almost from the start of the war. I-19 entered service in April of 1941, and from the first weeks had fought across the Pacific. In February of 42, her float plane even flew a night reconnaissance over Pearl Harbor, scouting for a second strike that, in the end, never came. Over 9 months of war, the boat had run reconnaissance, attacked transports, and worked in areas the Japanese command sent submarines to only reluctantly, filing the risk as unjustifiably high. Kinashi weighed risk differently than the staff did, not because he had a taste for gambling. The submarine service does not forgive gambling at all. A boat that misjudges its enemy simply does not come home from patrol, and no one ever learns what it did wrong. Kinashi came home. He knew how to balance threat against opportunity, the way only commanders whose instinct has already been paid for over several patrols can. That day, the position he had been hunting for months lay in front of him. The carrier group was steaming a steady course at a steady speed. The aircraft overhead pulled the lookout's attention upward, toward a threat that did not exist in that minute. To search reliably for a submarine with sonar, the escorts need to zigzag constantly at no less than 15 knots. A group busy recovering and launching aircraft did not fully meet those conditions. That was how a carrier worked. You cannot run flight operations by the book and hunt a submarine by the book at the same time. Nobody was expecting an underwater attack in that second, and that was not negligence. Knowing that Japanese boats are somewhere in the area and expecting a strike right now, at this exact point, are two fundamentally different things. Anti-submarine vigilance is a task you cannot hold at its peak indefinitely, least of all alongside flight operations. The escort commanders knew this better than anyone. They did what they could. Kinashi took his position. The only thing left was to settle the question of the weapon. The Japanese Type 95 torpedo was a scaled-down version of the famous Long Lance, the Type 93. Both ran on a principle that American and British designers had studied and rejected as too dangerous. Instead of compressed air, these torpedoes carried pure oxygen. The problem with an air torpedo has been known for a long time. When fuel burns in compressed air, it produces a great deal of insoluble nitrogen. The nitrogen rises as bubbles and leaves a white streak on the water behind the torpedo. A lookout on the bridge who spots that streak running toward the side gets a few seconds to shout the alarm and order a turn. Sometimes those seconds are enough for a ship to swing clear. When the fuel burns in pure oxygen, there is no streak. The products of the reaction are water and carbon dioxide, and they dissolve into the sea faster than they can rise. The Type 95 ran invisible. That was its first advantage, and in war it cost human lives directly, without metaphor. The ship did not turn away because it could not see what to turn away from. The second advantage was speed. At its top setting, the torpedo ran at 49 knots, 7 or 8 knots faster than the best American torpedoes of the time. Every extra knot means fewer seconds for the target to react, the difference between swinging clear and not. The third advantage was range. At a reduced setting, the oxygen torpedo ran reliably out to 12,000 meters, 12 kilometers. And that is the number that breaks the entire American calculation about safe distance between groups. The formations were held a few kilometers apart, and that was treated as protection. For a torpedo capable of running 12, a few kilometers were not an obstacle at all. They were simply a stretch of its ordinary path. The Americans in 1942 knew the Japanese had some kind of oxygen torpedoes. They did not know the exact figures. They did not know how perfectly the wakelessness worked in practice, or how far the weapon really reached. Every encounter with a Japanese torpedo added data, but that data was bought with ships, and often there was no one left to learn it. It is worth pausing on I-19 herself, because the type of the boat explains how she came to be in the right spot at all. She was a large, ocean-going submarine, the kind the Japanese fleet built to operate across the whole width of the Pacific, rather than near its own coast. She carried a disassembled float plane in a watertight hangar, could stay out for many weeks, and could cover distances beyond the reach of smaller boats. These were precisely the submarines Japan scattered across the ocean in the first year of the war, from Hawaii to the coast of Australia, hunting for lone targets and running reconnaissance. Most of those patrols came to nothing. The ocean is vast, convoys are rare, and the odds of being in the right place in the right minute are vanishingly small. Kinashi spent months running his boat through that emptiness, waiting for one good chance. On the 15th of September, the chance came, and he was ready for it. Kinashi chose the high-speed setting. The range to the Wasp allowed it. The angle was good. 6 torpedoes in a spread covered the width of the target with room to spare. If 3 of the 6 reached the hull, the carrier would be stopped. He did not think about what lay beyond the Wasp. A submarine commander looks through his periscope into a narrow attack sector. He sees the target. The Wasp filled his periscope view completely. The ships beyond the horizon of that hull, beyond several kilometers of water, in that second simply did not exist for him as a tactical quantity. At 14:44, he gave the order to fire. 6 Type 95 torpedoes left the bow tubes of I-19 a few seconds apart. They ran toward the Wasp, and they kept running past her. The first torpedo struck the starboard side of the Wasp at 14:44 and some seconds. It punched through the plating below the waterline and drove into the hull before the fuse tripped. The blast went off already inside, in the space between the outer side and the inner bulkheads. Part of the energy the hull absorbed, part of it went further. Bulkheads were pushed in, piping was torn, and in several compartments the lights went out at once. 3 seconds later came the second. It struck almost the same spot, slightly displaced. By that second, the bulkheads that were meant to contain the first hit were no longer holding. Water went where water always goes, once you remove whatever was stopping it. The third torpedo hit forward. 3 hits in a matter of seconds. That alone could have finished any ship. But on the Wasp that day, one more circumstance came together. And here is where that detail I asked you to remember comes back. The fuel line. On a carrier during flight operations, aviation gasoline is fed to the aircraft continuously. Hoses lie across the hangar deck, fuel in the system under pressure. That is standard. That is how every carrier worked on every flying day. There is no other way to fuel an aircraft, and on the Wasp, those lines, because of the missing tonnage, ran closer to the hull than on newer ships. The second blast ruptured a fuel line. Aviation gasoline is not just a fuel. It evaporates at room temperature. Its vapor is heavier than air and creeps low, spreading across the deck until it finds a spark. And in a compartment where a torpedo has just gone off and metal is tearing, sparks are more than plentiful. The gasoline found fire instantly, and the fire drove deep into the ship faster than anyone aboard could grasp what was even happening. That is where the fuel line led. One design compromise, accepted on paper years before the war to save tonnage. At 14:45, it turned a damaged but living ship into a burning one. Captain Forrest Sherman, the Wasp's commanding officer, in those first seconds received 3 reports almost at once. Torpedo hits to starboard. Fire in the hangar. Loss of power. He gave the orders he was bound to give. Dog down the watertight bulkheads. Get the firefighting parties up. Begin damage control. The crew carried them out the way any well-trained ship's crew would have. It did not help, and the problem was not the men. The Wasp's crew acted correctly. The problem was physics. Aviation gasoline spilled across several levels and ignited almost at the instant of impact, produced a fire that, in principle, cannot be fought with standard means. It burned from several sides at once. It burned from below. It burned in spaces the firefighting parties could not reach until the fire itself cut off their way. The men did everything right and lost anyway, because what was burning was not the kind of fire you put out, but the kind you can only outlast. And the ship could not outlast it. Forrest Sherman is worth remembering because we will come back to him at the very end, and what became of him will say more about this war than any conclusion of mine. Here I will note only one thing. The man losing his carrier on this day would, 7 years later, become the Chief of Naval Operations of the United States, the youngest in the entire history of the post at that time. The fleet, one of whose last 2 carriers is burning in front of Sherman right now, would in the end place all of itself in his hands. But that is 7 years away. Right now, at 1450, the Wasp is burning, and 3 torpedoes from that same Salvo are still running across the ocean. While the fire spread aboard the Wasp, 3 torpedoes from Kinashi's Salvo ran on along their course. They passed the sinking carrier. They passed the ships of her escort, which, in that minute, were turning toward the blasts and thinking of nothing but the Wasp. 3 steel cylinders, each 7 meters long and weighing more than 1.5 tons, with a warhead of 405 kilograms of explosive, ran at 49 knots across the open water toward where Kinashi had aimed them at the moment of firing. He had aimed at the Wasp, and a course laid through the Wasp led on beyond her, and 3 kilometers along that course steamed Task Force 17. The lookouts on the USS North Carolina saw nothing. The battleship got its first word of torpedoes in the carrier over the radio. Men aboard heard the blasts. They looked toward the Wasp and saw smoke. Nobody watching the water in that second was expecting an underwater threat at their own side. The Type 95 leaves no wake. There was nothing to see. At 14:52, 8 minutes after the first hit on the Wasp, one of the 3 torpedoes struck the USS North Carolina on the port side, forward. 5 sailors died in the blast. The breach in the hull ran about 10 meters below the waterline. Water poured into the forward compartments. The battleship took on a list to port that was later corrected by counterflooding. The turbines ran. The main battery turrets were intact. The bridge was untouched. The North Carolina survived. She survived the way a battleship knows how to survive, through margin of strength, through structural redundancy, through armored bulkheads that hold where a carrier's bulkheads would long since have given way. The same kind of hit that was killing the Wasp, the battleship took and stayed in the fight. The difference was not luck. The difference was the 5,000 tons the Wasp did not have, and the North Carolina did. And here is what makes this episode especially plain to see. The torpedo entered the battleship on the port side, forward, below the armor belt, and tore a breach in the plating a truck could have driven through. Hundreds of tons of water came in. The ship almost at once took on a list of about 5 degrees to port, and the North Carolina's damage control parties did exactly what they had been trained to do. They began counter-flooding compartments on the starboard side, letting water in on the other side to balance the ship. The list was corrected within minutes. The battleship never lost control for a second and never fell out of formation. She held station and held speed at about 25 knots, steaming right alongside the carrier whose sky she was covering. A 10-meter breach, dead men forward, hundreds of tons of water in the hull, and the ship holding formation at full speed through all of it. That is what 5,000 tons of difference are, once you translate them out of a displacement figure and into what happens to a ship in the minute it is hit. And in that same moment, the last of the 3 torpedoes found the 3rd target. The USS O'Brien, a Sims-class destroyer, was screening the same group. A destroyer's job is protection against submarines, against torpedo boats, against aircraft when the carrier's gunners cannot cope. A destroyer does not stop a blow with armor. It has almost none. It stops it with speed and maneuver. At about 14:54, the O'Brien's lookouts spotted a torpedo off the port bow, about 1,000 yards out. The destroyer went to full power and began swinging right. That torpedo passed close under her stern, a miss, and while all attention was fixed on it, a second torpedo struck the port bow, forward. The destroyer did not capsize and did not catch fire. That stunned everyone who had just watched what was happening to the Wasp. The blast was heavy. The bow was torn open, several compartments flooded. But the bulkheads held. The ship did not lose way. The engineers reported the main plant running. The captain reported the ship answering her helm. And not a single man of the crew died in the blast. It looked like pure luck. A ship took a torpedo and lived. It happened, not often with destroyers, but it happened. The O'Brien's crew set to assessing the damage, dogging bulkheads, pumping out water. The ship was holding. Remember that feeling. A ship that survived. A destroyer that got lucky. In 34 days, that sentence is going to turn over, and you will understand there was no luck here at all. But that comes later. First, the Wasp has to be buried. Aboard the Wasp, holding on was no longer working. The fire reached the magazines within the first hours. Everyone who knew the ship's layout understood that from the first minutes. The aviation ordnance sat several levels below the burning hangar deck, behind armored bulkheads. But an armored bulkhead holds a fire only so long. especially when the fire reaches it from several sides at once. The magazine explosions began within minutes. The first was heard on other ships several miles away. Captain Sherman did not wait for the second. He kept fighting for the ship, understanding the odds were shrinking. The firefighting parties worked until the fire cut off their paths. By then, part of the ship had become unreachable, and the men in the cut-off sections either got out on their own or did not. 193 men did not get out. At around 1700, Captain Sherman gave the order a commander gives last of all: abandon ship. And here it is important to understand that this was not panic. Crews that flee a ship in panic die in the water in far greater numbers than those who leave in order. The Wasp's crew left in the order they had been trained in. The wounded went out first. Men in the water were picked up by the escort's boats. Those who could swim swam to the nearest destroyers. On the boat deck, already burning aft, the men carrying the wounded stayed to the last. They went out last. Some of them went out through the fire. It was for exactly this, for the way a doomed ship was abandoned, that the fleet would later credit Forrest Sherman with hundreds of lives saved. Out of roughly 2,300 men in the crew, most were taken from the water alive. The destroyer USS Lansdowne came alongside the sinking carrier, with a task the Navy calls one of the hardest in the trade: to finish off your own ship, so that it will not fall to the enemy and will not be left in the middle of the ocean as a floating hazard to your own side. The Lansdowne fired 5 torpedoes into the side of the Wasp. American torpedoes, the same ones that were slower and left a wake. At 2100, the carrier went under. The submarine I-19 had gone deep long before. The escort's anti-submarine ships hunted her, dropping depth charges where they guessed her withdrawal lay. Kinashi maneuvered. The boat took several near misses. They punched nothing through, but they killed part of the lighting and jammed several pipe covers so that they had to be worked by hand. I-19 withdrew underwater at 8 knots, changing course and depth. The hunt dragged on for hours. Kinashi got away, whole, fully aware that he had sunk an American carrier and without the slightest idea of what his torpedoes had done beyond his periscope sector. And aboard the O'Brien, at that very time, the engineers were finishing their first damage survey and preparing a report for the captain. The report came out cautiously optimistic. Serious structural damage forward. First and second compartments partly flooded. Plating weakened in the blast area. Recommendation: proceed under her own power to the nearest base for full assessment and repair. The word recommendation is the key one here. It was the engineers' conclusion based on what they could see, and what they could see was what lay on the surface. They could not see what had happened inside the metal of the hull. And that, what happens to steel that has been shaken by a blast but has not split at the seams, is what the entire third part of this story is about. Metal that has passed through the shock wave of a torpedo is not always damaged the way it looks. This would come clear in 34 days. The O'Brien steamed on under her own power, and that in itself was hard to believe. The destroyer had taken a torpedo in the bow, and the first survey showed damage that was serious but, to all appearances, under control. The bulkheads were holding, the engines ran. The ship answered her helm. The captain reported to higher command that the situation was in hand. Commanders say in hand when they see what they see. The problem was what they could not see. The blast of a torpedo is not only a breach, it is a shock wave that passes through metal at a speed hard to believe until you work through the physics. 405 kilograms of explosive at the instant of detonation turn into an expanding gas in a few thousandths of a second. The pressure of that expansion strikes the metal of the hull all at once. Steel that withstood that pressure and did not part at the welds looks whole from the outside. Inside the steel, something else is happening. The crystalline structure of metal that has passed through a shockwave of that intensity changes at the microscopic level. This is not about visible cracks and not about dents a survey would catch. It is about the strength of the metal in the struck zone ceasing to match the strength of metal that never knew such a blow. And that difference shows up later, under load, under the working of the hull in a seaway, under the vibration of the engines on a long passage. The metal holds right up to the moment it stops holding, and there is almost no way to warn of it in advance with a survey. In 1942, these processes were understood less well than they are today. Naval engineers knew of the problem in theory, but they had almost no practical experience with ships that had survived a hit from a modern torpedo, for a simple reason. Most ships that took such a hit did not survive, which meant there was nothing on which to build that experience. The O'Brien left the battle area and set course for Espiritu Santo. At Espiritu Santo, she was inspected. The damage was recorded. She was cleared to continue under her own power. She went on. Noumea. Another inspection, the same verdict. Samoa. By the 19th of October, the destroyer had covered about 3,000 nautical miles from the point where the torpedo had entered her. 34 days of steaming. 3 intermediate inspections. Not one of them found a reason to stop. On the 19th of October, off Samoa, the O'Brien's hull began to break up amidships. Not fast and not like an explosion. What was breaking up was a structure that had held all this time on metal untouched by the blast, and was gradually ceasing to hold as the weakened sections passed their load to neighboring ones, also weakened, just a little less. The destroyer's light hull, shaken loose by the shock wave back on the 15th of September, gave way, seam by seam. The ship broke in two. The crew got off in time, all 250 men. In the sinking, no one died. The O'Brien went to the bottom southwest of Samoa 34 days after the torpedo entered her side. By then, the Japanese did not even know she still existed. No one fired at her a second time. No one finished her. Kinashi's torpedo killed this destroyer at a range of 3,000 miles, and a month and a third after the shot. Now, go back to the place where I asked you to remember the word lucky. The destroyer was not lucky. The destroyer was killed on the 15th of September, together with the Wasp. It simply needed 34 days to fall down. Now, let us look at what this Salvo did on the map, rather than to individual ships. On the 15th of September, as the Wasp went down and the O'Brien pulled out of the battle under her own power, the United States had one operational carrier left in the entire Pacific, USS Hornet. The Saratoga was still in the yard after the August torpedo. The Enterprise was finishing repairs after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, her return expected but not yet arrived. One carrier. On an ocean that stretches from Alaska to Australia, on a theater where the presence of an air umbrella decided whether a convoy reached its destination or laid down on the bottom on the way. One ship that could not be lost under any circumstances, because there was nothing to replace it with. And in Tokyo, they did not know it was the only one. Japanese naval intelligence in the autumn of '42 was working with incomplete data. The Americans did everything to hide the real state of affairs. Radio silence where it helped, false movements where the situation allowed. The Japanese knew for certain that the Wasp was sunk. They knew the Enterprise was damaged, but they did not know for certain the one thing that mattered. That the enemy had exactly one working carrier left in the whole South Pacific, and that sinking one more would leave the Americans with nothing. This was not the enemy's good fortune. It was an information gap. Kinashi's Salvo opened a window, and Japan did not see that it was open. Had they seen it, had they made the right decisions fast enough, the campaign for Guadalcanal might have gone another way. That if does not exist in history. The Japanese did not know, and they went on fighting for the island at the same pace as before. The Tokyo Express ran by night. By day, the fighters fought in the sky. The Marines held the perimeter around Henderson Field. Both sides went on finding out whose supply line would snap first, and one of the sides had no idea how close it had come to a decisive edge. On the 26th of October, 41 days after the loss of the Wasp, the battle off the Santa Cruz Islands closed this part of the story. By that day, the Enterprise had made it back into service, and the Americans once again had two carriers at sea, Hornet and Enterprise. The Japanese brought 4 carriers against them. This was the 4th and last carrier battle of the first year of the Pacific War, and it was brutal for both sides. Japanese aviation found the Hornet. The strike was dense and accurate. Dive bombers and torpedo planes came in waves. Bombs and torpedoes went into the ship, and 2 crippled Japanese aircraft, their pilots aimed straight into the Hornet in their last seconds, because they could no longer reach their own lines, and chose to take the ship with them. The Hornet caught fire and lost way. They tried to save her in earnest. A cruiser took the burning carrier in tow and dragged her out of the battle area. The crew fought for the ship hour after hour. But Japanese aviation kept coming back, adding hit after hit, and at some point it became clear the ship could not be saved. The crew was taken off. American destroyers fired their own torpedoes into the Hornet so she would not fall to the enemy, and even after that, she would not sink. She was finished off by Japanese ships that reached the scene in the night. The Hornet died, the same Hornet from which, that spring, the bombers of the Tokyo raid had lifted off. The second of the 2 carriers, steaming over one convoy on the 15th of September, now lay on the bottom as well. The Enterprise took serious damage in the same battle. Several bomb hits, wreckage, fires, but she stayed afloat and did not leave the fight. She was repaired right at sea, work never stopping while the battle still went on around her. It is said that in those days, a banner hung on her side that any Japanese pilot who came close enough could read. Enterprise, under repair. That was the truth, and it did not stop her. For several weeks of November 1942, at the height of the 2 naval battles for Guadalcanal, the Enterprise was the only American carrier in the South Pacific. One ship, with her repairs unfinished, with a damaged aircraft elevator that could not lift planes from the hangar deck to the flight deck, with systems only partly brought back online. And that one ship, half-mended, was enough to hold the edge in the air over the decisive convoys, while Guadalcanal hung by a thread. That is the window Kinashi opened on the 15th of September. It was real. It was dangerously narrow. For several weeks, the United States had exactly one carrier on the most important theater of the war, and it was damaged. Japan did not exploit that window to the full, partly because it did not know how large the window was, partly because logistics would not let it throw all the needed force at Guadalcanal at once, partly because the Enterprise, even with her repairs unfinished, remained a ship to be reckoned with. Guadalcanal held. By February of 43, the Japanese evacuated what was left of their forces from the island. The turn of the Pacific War had come, and one of the windows through which it could have slipped was opened by a submarine commander aiming at a single carrier. Takaichi Kinashi received the command's congratulations for the attack. His name was spoken in the Japanese fleet's official reports. I-19 went on serving. In 1943, Kinashi took command of another boat, I-29. She was a large submarine, fitted for long ocean passages, and she was sent on tasks that by then no surface ship could carry out. I-29 ran between Japan and occupied Europe along the so-called Yanagi route, around the Cape of Good Hope, out of reach of Allied command of the seas. She carried the strategic exchange between 2 allies who physically could not reach one another any other way. In 1944, I-29 was returning from Germany. Aboard, among other things, were samples and blueprints of German technology, the very reason those runs were made in the first place. Among them, by several accounts, was material connected to German jet engines, the very thing that might have given Japanese aviation what it did not have. On the 26th of July, 1944, I-29 was intercepted by the American submarine USS Sawfish in the Luzon Strait. Allied intelligence was reading the Japanese codes and knew where to wait. The sawfish fired torpedoes. I-29 went down with almost everything she carried. Takaichi Kinashi died with the ship. He was 38 years old. He was posthumously promoted 2 ranks in memory of the most effective torpedo attack of the Japanese submarine service in the entire war. The man whose torpedoes, on the 15th of September 1942, ran further than he could know, in the end died himself of a torpedo he, too, did not see in time. And what he was carrying on that last passage never reached Japan, exactly as his 3 torpedoes in 42 reached places he never sent them. Now to the numbers, because it is the numbers that make this episode what it became. 6 torpedoes, 1 salvo, 1 commander who worked out the angle and the speed and gave the order in the right second. 3 ships sunk or knocked out of the war by 1 action that took a matter of seconds. 5 hits from 6 torpedoes, 3 of them in a carrier, 1 in a battleship, 1 in a destroyer. 1 went into empty water. For this to become possible, several conditions had to line up at once. The carrier Wasp had to be steaming exactly the course and exactly the speed that gave Kinashi the angle that sent the spare torpedoes toward the second group. Shift the Wasp's course by a couple of degrees in any direction, and the outbound vector of the torpedoes would change so much that across 3 kilometers those couple of degrees would become hundreds of meters of miss. Task Force 17 had to be on exactly that course, at that distance, in that very minute. Had it been on another leg the moment Kinashi pressed the trigger, the torpedoes would have run through empty water. The battleship North Carolina and the destroyer O'Brien had to be in the danger zone at the same time. And destroyers in a screen constantly change position. Had the O'Brien been 500 meters off from where she was in that second, the torpedo would have run past. All of these conditions were met at once. And here is what has to be understood correctly. This does not mean it was all chance. Kinashi did not know about the second group and did not fire at it. But it does mean the result of his shot turned out wider than his intent. He aimed for 3 or 4 hits on 1 carrier. He got 5 hits on 3 different ships, including a battleship and a destroyer he never saw in his periscope. There is no second episode like it in the naval history of the Pacific War. 1 salvo from 1 position knocked a carrier, a battleship, and a destroyer out of the war at the same time. Not in separate battles of 1 campaign, not on separate days. In 1 moment, at 14:44 on the 15th of September, 1942. This was not a run of lucky hits. This was 1 shot that simply happened to have 3 targets instead of 1. The Wasp lies at a depth of more than 4,000 meters southwest of San Cristobal. She was never raised. Her crew numbered about 2,300 men. 193 of them stayed with the ship. The O'Brien vanished into the Pacific with no battle, a month after she was formally not killed. The only one of the 3 the torpedo reached on a delay of 34 days and 3,000 miles. The North Carolina survived. She finished the war, earned 15 battle stars, was never sunk, and today stands as a museum ship in Wilmington, in the state of North Carolina. If you go aboard her and walk forward on the port side to the place where, below the waterline in September of 42, a 10-meter breach was torn open, you will be standing at the point one of 3 torpedoes reached, torpedoes meant for an entirely different ship. If you have already been aboard this battleship, tell me in the comments whether you knew you were standing at the spot where a torpedo fired at a carrier 3 kilometers away came home. And Forrest Sherman, the captain who lost the Wasp on this day, would 7 years later become the Chief of Naval Operations of the United States and die in office in 1951, short of his 56th year. The fleet, one of whose last 2 carriers burned before his eyes, in the end handed him everything it had. Kinashi aimed at a carrier and hit it. And then his torpedoes kept running. And by the time the last of them finished its work, off Samoa, 34 days later, the man who fired them had long since gone deep, never knowing that 1 salvo of his had touched 3. If this kind of thing is what you came for, subscribe. One video like it every few weeks. Long form, no filler.